Good evening, my name is Bea. I'm a grade 12 student and I'm about to graduate. I'm beginning to experience that little crisis that I think a lot of high school students my age are starting to experience, where we begin to question whether anything we've learned up until this point is actually worth anything. I'm beginning to question whether anything I've learned will actually prepare me for life at university without home-cooked meals. As part of that, I found myself wanting to speak out more about issues that I care about, because this is one of my last chances to make any sort of immediate difference within our community. So I'm going to take that chance, despite the fact that not everyone necessarily cares what I actually have to say. In an effort to remain as straightforward and transparent as I can tonight, I'll be talking about the use of derogatory language against people with disabilities, specifically intellectual disabilities. It's one thing to be told that the word retard is offensive, but it's something entirely different to see with your own eyes the damage that one word can do. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 160 children worldwide are somewhere on the autism spectrum. That's a lot, which is why it often surprises me that so few people know what it actually means to be on the spectrum, or what life actually entails for these kids. That's the aim of my talk today, to provide some sort of insight and to raise awareness and understanding about not only the power of words, but to provide a little insight into a vision or perspective that isn't necessarily universal, but is something I think we should all strive to better understand. I'd like to make it clear that I know that there may be some people in the audience who can't necessarily relate to what I have to say tonight, because it requires some sort of personal connection. But that's my job tonight, to provide that personal connection. I'd like to start by introducing you to someone very special to me. This is my younger brother, James. Feel free to say, "Aw." He's in the audience tonight and will be thrilled to know that an entire audience of people agreed that he was, in fact, the cuter baby. James was born on August 10th, 2004, making him 15 years old as of today. His middle names are Edward and David, but when he was little, he couldn't actually say Edward, so he used to say Eggwood with a G. He loves sports. Rugby, soccer, you name it, he likes it. He also loves mushrooms. Ooh, I know, a bit controversial. He hates math, which I can definitely relate to. And he also hates really strong smells. For example, those little hand towels that you get given on airplanes, not a fan of them. James is also very easily annoyed, which I know from first-hand experience. He also sort of struggles to contain his emotions in ways that our society deems fit. You see, I didn't know it at the time, but when James was born, he was very, very sick. He spent the first 2 years of his life in and out of hospital. And of course, at the time, I was too young. I didn't get it. I didn't understand why I had to stay with family friends, why I couldn't be at home with my own family, with my new baby brother. Of course, I got older, and I found out that James is on the autism spectrum. And he also has ADHD, which makes life a little different for him than it is for me. One thing about people on the autism spectrum is that they all have their own little obsessions. My brother's obsession is sports. If you can name it, he definitely knows some weird niche statistic about it. James has been lucky enough to be on the SEC Rugby Club since we moved to Singapore almost 5 years ago. The club bases everything off of discipline, teamwork, and having fun. And it's the perfect combination. Those boys on the team support James both physically on the field, but of course emotionally off of it. And I'd be willing to place any amount of money on those kids based on the fact that I know just how good they are to him. Which is why it often surprises me that some kids can be so cruel, while others are so nice. See, a lot of the discrimination that James faces is indirect. He doesn't get a lot of people coming up to him saying, "Ooh, you're a weirdo." Sure, there are the occasional few, but there will always be people like that. The worst, he's told me, is when people use words like retard. Because whether straight to his face or not, these words have implications. So here's a little lesson to get everyone up to speed on what they actually mean. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines the word derogatory as a word that is expressive of a low opinion. In less robotic words, if something is derogatory, it belittles someone. I had a conversation with someone recently where they asked me what actually makes a word derogatory. And to be honest, this was a great question because I didn't actually know the answer. So, naturally, I did a little research, and here's what I found. If something is derogatory, it oppresses someone, a group, an individual, usually a minority. For example, in Australia, where I come from, we have a word, abo. It's an ethnic slur used to oppress Aboriginal Australians, and that makes it derogatory. The same is true of the word retard. Here's another little mini lesson on a couple of the more popular words or common words that are used against people with intellectual disabilities. Retard, or retarded. Mental retardation was a clinical diagnosis that used to be given to people with intellectual disabilities, but its use was discontinued because of the pain that the word carried. These days, it's used in a more colloquial sense. The dictionary definition clearly states up there on the screen that the word retard is outdated and offensive, and yet it's still used today to tell my brother that he is slow and incapable, both of which he is not. Here's another one. Spazz. Again, it says there on the board that the word is offensive, and yet it's just another one of the many words used to make people like my brother feel like they are less than what they are. Here's one last one. Autist. It says right there on the board that an autist is someone who has autism. So no, unfortunately, your friend who just made a bad joke doesn't actually count. You see, the problem with all of these words is that they've become ingrained and programmed into our everyday language, so that sometimes we don't even necessarily realize that we're using them. I'm not denying that language evolves, because that's a common argument that's used when I have conversations with people about this topic. I'm not denying it evolves. I'm not denying that it evolves, because that's just a fact. It does. But what doesn't evolve is the pain and suffering and the origins of these words for people who actually have disabilities, and for which these words actually implicate. I have a lot of conversations with people where they say, oh, but it's all about the intentions behind it. I didn't actually mean to cause harm, I just meant it in a jokey way. But that doesn't always sit well with me. Because when you say things like that, we're acting as though we have the power to decide that a word that has been used to oppress a minority group for years and years no longer oppresses them. And we don't have that power. And even if we did, it's not up to us. It's up to the people that are directly implicated. Now, there are more common and less common examples of disabilities, specifically intellectual. This is Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking had ALS, but he was also known to be one of the most intellectual and fundamental figures in developments of theoretical physics. This is Anthony Hopkins. Anthony Hopkins is a critically acclaimed actor who also just so happens to have Asperger's. Neither of these men fit into the stereotype that the word retard perpetuates. Yes, they have disabilities, but they still made something of themselves, proving that the word retard is simply not the word that we should be using to describe people with disabilities. Strong? Yes. Capable? Yes. Successful? Of course. But retarded? Definitely not. My aim today isn't necessarily to advocate for the complete eradication of these words, because unfortunately, that's quite an optimistic dream. Instead, I'm trying to educate. So, here's another analogy that I think may help. In Australia, there used to be a campaign called Keep Australia Beautiful. It focused on littering in Australia and trying to mitigate it. You see, like a lot of places, people in Australia used to litter all the time. It was not uncommon to be driving down the highway and see someone just chuck their Macca's wrapper right out the window. People knew that littering wasn't necessarily the best thing to do, but that didn't really stop them from doing it. That is until the government commissioned this campaign. They educated people, and now people in Australia are much better about it. Of course, there are the occasional few that still throw it out on the side of the road. But the point is that there are enough people surrounding them who understand the implications and can pull them up on it and say, hey, maybe don't do that. Now, I know what you're thinking. What could McDonald's wrappers possibly have to do with derogatory language being used against people with disabilities? Well, I'd like you to think of these words like littering. Right now, there are quite a few people that I know that you know who use these words. They may understand that they're harmful, or they may not. But the point is that we're all educated and aware of the repercussions of using these words, that we're able to pull them up and say, hey, there are other words you can use. See, my aim today, like I said previously, isn't to eradicate their use. Instead, I want to create a little ripple effect. Because if I can reach out to one of you, then you can reach out to someone else, and it can continue on. And hopefully, everyone else can be a little bit more educated on it. My dad said something to me the other day when I was preparing for this speech. He said that ultimately, it comes down to opening your eyes, opening your minds, and opening your hearts. I'd like to urge everyone in the audience today to open your eyes to the issue, to see that people with disabilities are more than just what a word tells you that they are. I'd like to ask everyone in the audience to open your minds to see and understand the repercussions of the language that we choose to use on a daily basis. And most importantly, I'd like to ask you to open your hearts to the issue. Because at the end of the day, it's not about you or me. And it's about being compassionate and caring enough to see that and recognize it. It's not about you or me. It's about people like my brother, and making sure that he is able to live the life that he wants to live. It's about making sure that he isn't kept within the confines that a word places him in. And it's about making sure that he can live his life the way he wants, to the fullest, without being discriminated against, without being hurt by a word, just because he's a little different. Thank you.